In Millfield's O'Malley's pub, a quiet woman with a slight limp was about to order a beer when she faced shocking discrimination. Maria Santos wasn't your typical VA counselor. For over a decade, she'd served in the army, known for saving her squad from an IED blast that cost her leg. When Patrick O'Malley refused her service, claiming she looked like trouble, she had no idea this moment would ignite her military brotherhood. Santos walked away with dignity, but her response would lead to 5 soldiers arriving in dress, uniform. What began as seeking a peaceful drink would become a powerful demonstration of honor that changed Millfield forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the windows of O'Malley's pub. Like artillery fire in the distance, a comparison Maria Santos made without thinking, then immediately tried to push away. She'd had enough memories surface during today's session with Rodriguez, the young Marine who'd lost his arm to an IED outside Fallujah. His phantom pain mirrored her own in ways that went deeper than missing limbs. Maria pushed through the heavy wooden door, her prosthetic leg creating the slightest hitch in her stride that most people wouldn't notice. The warmth hit her face, carrying the familiar scent of beer, old wood, and something frying in the kitchen. She'd chosen O'Malley's specifically because it looked like the kind of place where a person could sit quietly with a drink and decompress without anyone asking questions. The pub's interior was exactly what she'd expected: dark wood paneling, faded sports memorabilia, and the kind of worn furniture that had absorbed decades of conversations. A handful of regulars occupied the bar stools, their attention focused on a basketball game playing on the mounted television. In the corner booth, an elderly man sat alone with a beer and what looked like a half-finished crossword puzzle. Maria chose a table near the window, settling into the chair carefully. The phantom pain in her missing leg had been acting up all day, triggered by the barometric pressure and the stress of counseling sessions that hit too close to home. She pulled off her damp jacket, revealing a simple grey sweater that did nothing to hide her Hispanic features or suggest the Purple Heart that sat in a drawer back at her apartment. The young man behind the bar, barely out of his teens, with sandy hair and an earnest expression, looked up from washing glasses. He started to move toward her table, but a sharp voice from the kitchen stopped him. "Tommy, get back here. I'll handle the customers." Patrick O'Malley emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a stained apron. 52 years old, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent lines of dissatisfaction, he carried himself with the authority of a man who'd inherited his domain rather than earned it. His eyes swept over Maria's table, taking in her appearance with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent years making snap judgments about people. Maria could feel his evaluation, the slight limp she couldn't completely hide, the way her jeans and sneakers marked her as working class, the color of her skin in a town that was predominantly white. She'd faced this kind of scrutiny before, in job interviews and grocery stores, at VA appointments where civilian staff looked at her like she was trying to claim benefits she hadn't earned. "What can I get you?" Patrick's tone was neutral, but Maria caught the wariness underneath. "Beer, please, whatever you have on tap, and a burger if the kitchen's still open." Patrick's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something about her request, or perhaps the way she'd made it, confident, direct, without the deference he expected, triggered a reaction Maria recognized but had hoped to avoid tonight. "Kitchen closed 20 minutes ago." His lie came easily, contradicted by the sound of a grill still sizzling in the background. "Just the beer, then." Patrick crossed his arms, his stance widening slightly. In the corner booth, the elderly man looked up from his crossword, his weathered features creasing with what might have been recognition or concern. "You know what?" Patrick's voice carried an edge that made Tommy look up from behind the bar. "I don't think we can serve you tonight." The words hit Maria like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, she'd faced this before, but because she'd foolishly hoped for one evening of peace. "Is there a problem with my ID?" "Problem is, you look like trouble. And I don't serve troublemakers in my establishment." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the television seemed muted as the weight of Patrick's words settled over the pub. Maria felt the familiar surge of anger, the same fire that had driven her to throw herself on top of Rodriguez and Jenkins when the IED detonated, sacrificing her leg to save their lives. But this wasn't Iraq, and there was no enemy to fight, except ignorance wrapped in false authority. Tommy's face had gone pale behind the bar. "Dad, maybe—" "Stay out of this, son." Patrick's voice carried a warning that made the young man step back, though his expression remained troubled. In the corner booth, Frank Kowalski's hand tightened around his beer bottle. The old man's eyes held a complexity Maria couldn't read: pain, recognition, and something that might have been shame. She wondered if he'd recognize the look in her eyes, the particular weight that came from carrying invisible wounds. Maria stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to educate this man about the price she'd paid for his freedom to discriminate. She thought of the shrapnel still embedded in her hip, the nightmares that woke her most mornings, the way Rodriguez had cried in her office today when describing the phantom pain in his missing arm. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that came from facing real danger. "Have a good evening." She pulled on her jacket with movements that betrayed none of the turmoil inside. Patrick watched her with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully defended his territory against an imagined threat. Tommy looked like he wanted to say something, but lacked the courage to challenge his father. As Maria walked toward the door, Frank Kowalski caught her eye for just a moment. In that brief contact, she saw something that made her pause. The recognition of one veteran acknowledging another, complicated by decades of his own buried pain and the bitter knowledge that some battles couldn't be won with honor intact. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the sudden quiet of O'Malley's pub. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming, washing away the warmth she'd briefly found, but doing nothing to cleanse the sting of humiliation that followed her into the night. Behind her, Tommy stared at his father with something approaching horror, while Frank Kowalski returned to his crossword with hands that trembled slightly around his beer. Neither man spoke, but both carried the weight of witnessing something that demanded a response they weren't ready to give. The evening that had started as a simple search for peace had become another reminder that some wounds never fully heal, and that the battles veterans fight at home can cut deeper than any enemy fire. Maria's apartment key trembled in her hand as she stood outside her door, the rain from O'Malley's still dripping from her jacket onto the worn hallway carpet. The phantom pain in her missing leg had intensified during the drive home. A cruel reminder that her body still carried Iraq, even when her mind tried to leave it behind. She pushed open the door to her modest one-bedroom apartment, the silence greeting her like an old, unwelcome friend. The apartment was sparse but clean. A few pieces of second-hand furniture, VA paperwork neatly stacked on a small desk, and a single framed photo on the kitchen counter showing her squad before the deployment that changed everything. She avoided looking at it most days, but tonight the faces seemed to call out to her from across the small room. Maria settled onto her couch, still wearing her damp clothes, and closed her eyes. Patrick O'Malley's words echoed in her mind. "I don't serve troublemakers." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been called a troublemaker by drill sergeants who'd pushed her to excel, by officers who'd recognized her potential, by the enemy who'd learned to fear her unit's effectiveness. But tonight, it was meant as a wound, Her phone buzzed. A text from Anna, working late at the diner. Hope your day was better than mine. Some creep filmed a couple arguing and posted it online for drama content. People are awful. Maria stared at the message, a cold dread settling in her stomach. She opened her social media apps with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, scrolling through the local feeds until she found it. The video was grainy, shot from a phone across O'Malley's parking lot. The angle captured her walking out of the pub, her slight limp visible, her face a mask of controlled dignity. The caption read, "Local business owner stands up to troublemaker. Finally, someone with backbone in this town. Try, support local, try no trouble." The comments were worse than the video itself. Dozens of people applauding Patrick's courage, making assumptions about her character based on 30 seconds of footage. A few defended her, pointing out that she'd done nothing wrong, but they were drowned out by the chorus of approval for what they saw as justified discrimination. Maria's hand shook as she set the phone down. In Iraq, she'd known who the enemy was. Here the threat was invisible, embedded in the assumptions of people who'd never worn a uniform, never sacrificed anything more significant than convenience. 300 miles away in Fort Bragg, Staff Sergeant James "Tank" Rodriguez was finishing his evening workout when his phone rang. Ana Santos's name flashed on the screen, a contact he'd maintained since returning from Iraq, part of his promise to watch over Maria's family while she recovered. "Tank, you need to see something." Anna's voice carried an anger that made him stop mid-rep on the pull-up bar. "What's wrong?" "Someone posted a video of Maria getting kicked out of a bar. They're calling her a troublemaker. It's going viral in our area." Tank's jaw tightened. "Send it to me." The video loaded slowly on his phone, but Tank didn't need high definition to understand what he was seeing. Maria's controlled exit, the satisfied expression on the man in the doorway, the comments celebrating what was clearly discrimination. It all painted a picture that made his vision blur with rage. Tank had been there when Maria threw herself on top of Rodriguez and Jenkins, absorbing the blast that should have killed them all. He'd held her hand while the medics worked, promising her that her sacrifice meant something, that they'd all make it home together. Now, watching her walk away from another kind of attack with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in the field hospital, he felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt mixing with protective fury. He scrolled to Lisa Chen's contact. She'd be working her night shift at Charlotte General, but this couldn't wait. Lisa answered on the second ring, her voice professional despite the late hour. "Tank, everything okay?" "No, it's not. Someone just humiliated Maria and posted it online. We need to do something." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for Tank to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Lisa's voice came back, stripped of its usual calm. "Send me the video." Lisa Chen stood in the break room of Charlotte General's emergency department, her scrubs still carrying the scent of antiseptic and adrenaline from a busy shift. The video played on her phone screen, and with each viewing, her anger crystallized into something harder and more focused. She remembered Maria's face in the immediate aftermath of the IED blast, conscious but glazed with shock, asking about her soldiers even as blood pooled beneath her mangled leg. Lisa had worked frantically to stabilize her, all while Maria insisted that Rodriguez and Jenkins be treated first. That kind of selflessness didn't disappear just because someone traded their uniform for civilian clothes. Lisa opened her contacts and began making calls. Rodriguez first. He was teaching high school now in Denver, but maintained his reserve status. Then Williams, who'd finished law school and joined a firm in Phoenix. Thompson was somewhere in California, working construction and fighting his own demons, but he'd always answered when any of them called. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial confusion, growing anger as they watched the video, and finally, the kind of determined planning that had made their unit effective in Iraq. Back in her apartment, Maria's phone had become a source of torment. The video's reach was expanding beyond Millfield, picking up shares and comments from strangers who knew nothing about her service, but felt qualified to judge her worth. She'd fought the urge to respond, to defend herself, to explain that she'd earned her place in any establishment in America through sacrifice these people couldn't imagine. Instead, she closed the apps and tried to focus on tomorrow's schedule at the VA center. 3 counseling sessions, a group therapy meeting, and paperwork that would keep her mind occupied. But sleep felt impossible with Patrick O'Malley's words, echoing in her head, and the knowledge that strangers were celebrating her humiliation. Her phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Tank's name on the screen. "Maria, I saw the video. Tank, don't. We're coming." The certainty in his voice stopped her protest. This was the same tone he'd used when planning operations in Iraq, the voice of a leader who'd already made his decision and was simply informing others of the reality. "You can't just, we're your unit, Maria. Then now always, nobody gets to treat you like that and think it's acceptable." After Tank hung up, Maria sat in her dark apartment and felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the army. The knowledge that she wasn't alone. Her military family was mobilizing, and for the first time since walking out of O'Malley's pub, she allowed herself to hope that this story might have a different ending than the one Patrick O'Malley had written. The grey dawn over Millfield broke through Maria's apartment windows as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee. She'd managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep, her mind cycling between the humiliation at O'Malley's and Tank's, promise that echoed with the authority of someone who'd never failed to keep his word. Her phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, most from numbers she didn't recognize, reporters who'd somehow gotten her contact information after the video went viral. A knock at her door made her freeze. It was barely 7 a.m., too early for most visitors, but exactly the time Tank would arrive if he'd driven through the night. Maria limped to the door, her prosthetic feeling heavier than usual after yesterday's stress, and peered through the peephole. Tank stood in the hallway wearing his dress blue uniform, the fabric crisp despite what must have been hours of driving. Behind him, equally pristine in their military bearing, stood Lisa Chen, and 2 other figures Maria recognized with a mixture of joy and apprehension, Rodriguez and Williams, both in dress uniform, both carrying themselves with the precision that had kept their unit alive in Iraq. Maria opened the door to Tank's steady gaze, the same expression he'd worn when planning their most dangerous missions. "Morning, Sergeant Santos." "Tank, you can't be here in uniform. This is civilian business. This is family business." Lisa stepped forward, her medical training evident in the way she assessed Maria's condition with a quick glance. "You look tired." Rodriguez, now broader through the shoulders than during their deployment, but carrying the same gentle strength that had made him an effective teacher, smiled with genuine warmth. "Good to see you, Maria. Wish it was under better circumstances." Williams, his law school training evident in his measured speech, nodded professionally. "We've reviewed the video and the applicable regulations. What we're planning is completely within bounds." Maria stepped back, allowing them into her modest apartment. The space felt smaller with 4 people in dress uniform occupying it, their combined presence transforming her civilian sanctuary into something that felt military again. "What exactly are you planning?" Maria asked, though part of her already knew. Tank settled into her kitchen chair, his uniform maintaining its perfect lines despite the long drive. "We're going to O'Malley's pub. We're going to order drinks. And we're going to demonstrate what respect looks like." "Tank, you could get in trouble. All of you could. This isn't worth—" "Maria." Lisa's voice carried the same authority she'd used when ordering treatments in the field hospital. "Do you remember what you told me after the IED? When I was working on your leg And you kept asking about Rodriguez and Jenkins. Maria's throat tightened. She remembered the morphine haze, the desperate need to know her soldiers were safe, the way Lisa had kept talking to keep her conscious. You said family protects family. That we don't leave anyone behind, especially not when they're hurt. Lisa's eyes held the intensity that had made her such an effective combat medic. Well, you're hurt now. Different kind of wound, but it's still a wound. And we're still family. Rodriguez pulled out his phone, showing Maria a stream of supportive messages from veterans across the country who'd seen the video. It's not just us, Maria. Your story is resonating. People understand what happened to you, and they're angry about it. Williams, ever the lawyer, opened a folder he'd carried in. I've researched the relevant laws. What happened to you was clear discrimination, possibly actionable under several statutes, but more importantly, what we're planning is completely legal. We're simply exercising our right to patronize a public establishment while wearing the uniform of the United States Army. Tank leaned forward, his expression serious. There's someone else who wants to help. Captain Torres from your old company. He's driving down from Fort Bragg. Torres? He wasn't even... No, he wasn't in Iraq with us, but he's our current. Go, and he believes in taking care of soldiers. When he saw the video and heard what we were planning, he said it was his responsibility to be here. Maria felt overwhelmed by the support, but also afraid of the potential consequences. What if this makes things worse? What if you all get disciplined? The Tank's expression grew darker. Maria, do you know what they're saying about you online? Some of the comments are calling you a stolen valor case. They're saying you're probably faking your service record. The words hit Maria like physical blows. Stolen valor, the accusation that she'd lied about her military service, was perhaps the worst insult that could be leveled at a veteran. It negated everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd endured. Lisa reached across the table and took Maria's hand. We can't let that stand. We won't let that stand. A new knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Tank rose to answer it, returning with a man Maria recognized from official ceremonies, but had never met personally. Captain Michael Torres stood in the doorway, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing that of an officer comfortable with command, but humble enough to respect the veterans who'd seen combat he'd never faced. Sergeant Santos. Torres's voice carried genuine respect. I wanted to meet you before we proceed, to make sure you're comfortable with what we're planning. Sir, I don't want anyone's career damaged because of what happened to me. Torres studied her for a moment, then sat down at her small kitchen table. Sergeant, I've read your service record. I've studied the after-action reports from the IED incident. What you did that day saved lives and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Army. The idea that someone would question your honor, your right to be treated with basic human dignity. He paused, choosing his words carefully. That's not acceptable to me as an officer or as an American. Rodriguez, who'd been quiet during Torres's introduction, finally spoke. Maria, you threw yourself on that IED to save me and Jenkins. You lost your leg so we could come home whole. The least we can do is throw ourselves on this situation to save your honor. The apartment fell silent, except for the distant sound of Millfield waking up outside. Maria looked around the table at these 4 soldiers, each representing a different aspect of military service. The veteran leader, the healer, the teacher, the intellectual, and the officer who'd never seen combat, but understood duty. What exactly are you proposing? She asked finally. Tank smiled, the expression carrying both warmth and determination. We're going to show Mr. O'Malley and this town what a real troublemaker looks like. 5 veterans in dress uniform, conducting ourselves with perfect military, bearing, ordering drinks, and demonstrating the kind of respect you deserve. And if he refuses to serve you? Then, Captain Torres said quietly, we'll sit there in silence until he changes his mind, or until the whole town understands exactly what kind of man they're supporting. Maria felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the army, the certainty that came from having backup, from knowing that when the mission began, her team would be there beside her. The wounded feeling from last night's humiliation was still there, but it was being crowded out by something stronger. The knowledge that some bonds couldn't be broken by time, distance, or the transition from military to civilian life. At precisely 1800 hours, 5 veterans in dress blue uniforms walked down Main Street toward O'Malley's pub. Their movement was deliberate, measured, each step synchronized not through conscious effort, but through years of shared training and mutual trust. Captain Torres led the formation, his bearing that of an officer who understood the weight of the moment. Tank, Lisa, Rodriguez, and Williams followed in a loose diamond formation that spoke to their combat experience without appearing overtly military to civilian observers. Word had already spread through Millfield's tight-knit community. Mrs. Henderson, from the flower shop, stood in her doorway, her expression unreadable. 2 construction workers had stopped their truck to watch from across the street. A small crowd was gathering, some drawn by curiosity, others by the understanding that something significant was about to happen. Maria walked 50 yards behind them, her civilian clothes feeling suddenly inadequate compared to the crisp uniforms of her unit. She'd insisted on being present despite their protests, needing to face this moment rather than hide from it. Doctor. Sarah Kim walked beside her, having driven down from the VA center after canceling her afternoon appointments. You don't have to do this, Dr. Kim said quietly. We could handle this through official channels, file discrimination complaints. No. Maria's voice carried the same determination that had driven her to throw herself on the IED. This isn't about legal remedies. This is about respect, about making it clear that what happened last night isn't acceptable. Inside O'Malley's pub, Patrick was wiping down glasses with more force than necessary, his movements sharp with irritation. The lunch crowd had been sparse, and he'd spent the morning fielding calls from reporters wanting comments about the incident. His wife had called twice, her voice tight with worry about the negative attention their business was receiving. Tommy worked behind the bar with obvious tension, his eyes frequently moving to the front windows. He'd spent the night reading the online comments about the video, his stomach churning as strangers celebrated his father's actions. Several of his college friends had called, having seen the viral video, their voices carrying judgment that made Tommy want to defend his father and condemn him simultaneously. Frank Kowalski sat in his usual corner booth, but today his crossword puzzle remained untouched. The beer in front of him had grown warm as he stared at the table, lost in memories of his own return from Vietnam, the hostile crowds, the spitting protesters, the way civilians had looked at him like he was diseased. He'd told himself that Maria's situation was different, that times had changed, but the sick feeling in his stomach suggested otherwise. The front door opened with the deliberate weight that announced serious intention. Captain Torres entered first, his uniform catching, the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The conversation at the bar died immediately as Tank, Lisa, Rodriguez, and Williams followed him inside, their bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian setting. Patrick's face went pale, then flushed red as he recognized what was happening. These weren't random soldiers. The purposeful way they moved, the coordinated timing, the crisp perfection of their uniforms all spoke to a deliberate demonstration. "We'd like a table, please," Captain Torres said, his voice carrying the authority of command without aggression. "For 5. Patrick's hands stilled on the glass he'd been cleaning. Around the pub, the few afternoon patrons had gone silent, sensing the tension that filled the space like smoke. Tommy stepped forward. but his father's sharp gesture stopped him. "I don't know what this is about," Patrick said, his voice carrying false bravado, "but this is my establishment, and I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Tank stepped forward slightly, not enough to seem threatening, but enough to make his presence felt. "Sir, we're here as customers. We'd like to order drinks and perhaps some food. We'll conduct ourselves with appropriate military bearing and pay for our service." "Military bearing?" Patrick's voice rose slightly. "Is that what you call intimidation? Coming in here in uniform to threaten a civilian business owner?" Lisa, her medical training evident in her calm assessment of the situation, spoke with measured precision. "Sir, we're not threatening anyone. We're simply 5 veterans who would like to enjoy a drink in a public establishment." Frank Kowalski watched the confrontation from his corner booth, his memories of Vietnam crystallizing into a moment of moral clarity. The way Patrick was treating these uniformed soldiers echoed the hostility Frank had faced decades ago, but with a crucial difference. These soldiers weren't being attacked for their service, but their presence was exposing the discrimination faced by one of their own. "You want to know what this is about?" Frank's voice cut through the tension as he stood from his booth. His 77-year-old frame moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "This is about a Purple Heart recipient who got kicked out of here last night for the crime of being Hispanic and wearing civilian clothes." Patrick's face went white as Frank continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "These soldiers are here because you treated one of their own like garbage. And you know what? They're showing you more respect than you showed her." Tommy stepped out from behind the bar, his voice shaking with emotion. "Dad, just serve them. Please, Tommy, get back." "No." Tommy's voice carried a strength that surprised everyone, including himself. "I watched what you did last night, and I was ashamed. These people served our country, and you're treating them like enemies." Rodriguez, who'd remained silent until now, spoke with the gentle authority that had made him an effective teacher. "Sir, we're not here to cause trouble. We're here to demonstrate something simple, that respect should be earned through character, and service, not determined by appearance or assumptions." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the front door opening again. Maria entered with Dr. Kim, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic in the room. Patrick's eyes widened as he recognized her from the night before, understanding, finally dawning about what he was facing. Captain Torres turned to Maria with formal courtesy. "Sergeant Santos, would you care to join us for a drink?" Maria looked around the pub, at Patrick's pale face, at Tommy's expression of hope and fear, at Frank Kowalski standing in support of veterans he'd never met, at her unit maintaining perfect discipline while making their point clear. "I'd be honored, sir," she said quietly. Tommy stepped forward, his decision made. "Right this way, I'll get you a table." As he led them to the largest table in the pub, Patrick stood frozen behind the bar, finally understanding that he wasn't just facing 5 soldiers in uniform. He was facing the consequences of his own choices, reflected in the perfect military bearing of people who'd earned their right to respect through sacrifice he couldn't comprehend. The real confrontation, everyone understood, was just beginning. By morning, the photograph had traveled far beyond Millfield's borders. Someone had captured the moment when the 5 veterans sat down at their table while Patrick O'Malley stood, frozen behind his bar, and that image now graced the front pages of newspapers from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. The headline in the Millfield Gazette read, "Local pub confronted by military after discrimination incident." Dr. Sarah Kim sat in her VA office at 6 a.m., fielding calls from news outlets across the region. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since. The story broke nationally, with reporters wanting expert commentary on veteran discrimination and the psychological impact of civilian rejection on military personnel. "Yes, this is unfortunately more common than people realize," she told a reporter from Channel 8 News. Veterans often face invisible discrimination based on assumptions about their appearance, their economic status, or their ethnicity. What makes this case significant is that it was documented, and it prompted a response from the veteran community. 3 miles away, Patrick O'Malley stood in his empty pub, reading the morning news coverage on his phone with growing horror. The articles didn't just report the facts. They provided context about Maria's Purple Heart, details about the IED attack that cost her leg, and background about the discrimination veterans face when reintegrating into civilian life. One article included quotes from military historians comparing the peaceful demonstration to sit-ins during the civil rights movement. Another featured interviews with local veterans who shared their own experiences of discrimination in Millfield businesses. The narrative being constructed in the media painted Patrick not just as a prejudiced business owner, but as a symbol of civilian ingratitude toward military sacrifice. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Channel 8 wants an interview. What do I tell them?" Patrick stared at the message, understanding that any response would either make him look defensive or admitting guilt. The business phone had rung constantly since dawn, some callers expressing support for his right to refuse service, others promising to boycott O'Malley's until he apologized publicly to Maria Santos. Tommy emerged from the kitchen carrying a box of newspapers, his face grim. "Dad, you need to see this." He spread the papers across the bar, each carrying a variation of the same story. The local paper had run an editorial titled, "When Prejudice Meets Service," while the regional business journal questioned whether Millfield's reputation for veteran support was just marketing. "This is getting out of hand," Patrick muttered, but even as he said it, he knew the words sounded hollow. The situation had been out of hand the moment he'd refused to serve Maria Santos. At Millfield High School, Councilwoman Rebecca Walsh was addressing an emergency meeting of the town council. The conference room was packed beyond capacity, with veterans, business owners, and concerned citizens creating a tension that threatened to spill over into open conflict. "The situation at O'Malley's pub has brought national attention to our community," Walsh began, her political instincts telling her to find middle ground while her personal convictions pushed her toward taking a stand. "We need to discuss how we want Millfield to be represented in the ongoing coverage." Bill Henderson, who owned the hardware store, raised his hand. "With respect, Councilwoman, this is about one business owner's right to run his establishment as he sees fit. We can't let outside pressure dictate how we handle local affairs." Outside pressure? The voice belonged to Janet Rodriguez, a Korean War veteran's widow whose husband had died the previous year. "This isn't outside pressure. This is about how we treat the people who served our country. My Harold didn't survive Chosin Reservoir, so his brothers could be treated like criminals in their own hometown." The room erupted in competing voices, some defending Patrick's rights as a business owner, others demanding accountability for what they saw as shameful treatment of a Purple Heart recipient. Walsh recognized the dynamics at play: economic anxiety mixing with generational differences and genuine disagreement about the role of military service in civilian society. Dr. Kim, who'd been invited to provide expert perspective, stood to address the room. "If I may," her calm voice cutting through the chaos, "this isn't really about Mr. O'Malley's rights as a business owner. This is about how a community chooses to honor or dishonor the sacrifices made on its behalf." She gestured to the packed room. Sergeant Santos lost her leg saving her squad members. She came home and chose to work at the VA center, helping other veterans reintegrate into civilian life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thursday, she was denied service at a local business based purely on assumptions about her appearance. That's not a business rights issue. That's a community values issue. Meanwhile, Maria was experiencing the surreal feeling of becoming a reluctant public figure. Her morning session with a PTSD support group had been interrupted by reporters waiting in the VA center parking lot. The veterans in her group had reacted with protective anger, several volunteering to escort the media somewhere else, in terms that left no doubt about their intentions. "This isn't what I wanted," Maria told Dr. Kim during an emergency counseling session. "I just wanted a quiet drink. Now I'm being held up as some kind of symbol." "You are a symbol," Dr. Kim replied gently. "You're a symbol of service, of sacrifice, and of the dignity that survives even when civilians fail to recognize it. The question is whether you're comfortable with that role." Maria stared out the window at the reporters still waiting in the parking lot. "I spent years learning to be invisible in civilian life, trying not to stand out, not to make people uncomfortable with my prosthetic or my service record. Now everyone knows who I am. And how does that feel? Terrifying, but also—" Maria paused, searching for the right words. "When Tank and the others showed up yesterday, when they put on their dress uniforms and walked into that pub, for the first time since I left the army, I felt like my service meant something to someone other than me." Back at O'Malley's pub, Patrick was discovering that controversy was bad for business in ways he hadn't anticipated. Two of his regular suppliers had called to re-evaluate their relationships, citing the negative publicity. The regional beer distributor had hinted that supporting businesses that discriminated against veterans might conflict with their company values. Tommy had spent the morning updating their social media accounts, trying to manage the flood of negative reviews and angry comments. "Dad, we're getting killed online. People are posting pictures of the pub with warnings to other veterans to stay away." Patrick looked at his son, 19 years old, idealistic, and clearly ashamed of his father's actions. "What do you think I should do?" For the first time in years, Tommy looked his father directly in the eye. "Apologize, publicly, and mean it." The simple suggestion hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of everything Patrick had built and everything he might lose. Outside, another news van was pulling into the parking lot, its satellite dish reflecting the afternoon sun like a beacon drawing attention to a story that showed no signs of fading away. Patrick O'Malley was beginning to understand that some actions create consequences that extend far beyond their original scope, and that the respect he demanded as a business owner paled in comparison to the respect earned by people willing to sacrifice everything for others. Frank Kowalski had been walking toward Maria's apartment for 20 minutes, turning around twice before forcing himself to continue. At 77, he'd perfected the art of avoiding difficult conversations, but yesterday's events at O'Malley's had awakened something in him that refused to be silenced again. He found Maria sitting on the small porch behind her apartment building, her prosthetic leg extended in front of her as she worked through physical therapy exercises Dr. Kim had recommended for managing phantom pain. She looked up as his shadow fell across the concrete steps, her expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Kowalski." She didn't sound surprised to see him, though she couldn't have expected this visit. "Frank, please, and I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've been carrying something around for 48 years, and after what happened at O'Malley's, I can't carry it anymore." Maria gestured to the concrete step beside her. Frank settled down with the careful movements of a man whose body had absorbed decades of unspoken pain, his weathered hands clasping together as he searched for words he'd never said aloud. "Vietnam, 1971, he began, his voice carrying the particular tone veterans used when sharing stories they'd kept buried. "I came home on a Friday afternoon, flew into Pittsburgh wearing my dress greens because I was proud of my service. proud and stupid. Frank's eyes focused on something Maria couldn't see, memories playing out in the middle distance. The airport was different then. No security, no separation between military and civilian passengers. I walked through the terminal and people stared, not with respect, with something that felt like hatred. Maria stopped her exercises, recognizing the weight of what Frank was preparing to share. She'd counseled enough Vietnam veterans to know that their homecoming experiences carried trauma that often exceeded their combat memories. There was a group of protesters outside the terminal, college kids mostly, with signs about baby killers and war criminals. They saw my uniform and surrounded me. Frank's voice grew quieter. They called me a murderer, threw things. One girl, couldn't have been more than 20, spit in my face and told me I was a disgrace to humanity. The phantom pain in Maria's legs seemed to intensify as she listened, understanding that Frank was describing a different kind of IED, one that exploded upon returning home rather than in a foreign country. I never wore my uniform again after that day. Put it in a box in my closet and told myself I was done being a soldier. Found work at the steel mill, kept my head down, and tried to forget I'd ever served. Frank turned to look at Maria directly. For 48 years, I've been avoiding situations where someone might treat me the way those protesters did. And Thursday night, when O'Malley treated you like garbage, I recognized what was happening. But I was too much of a coward to speak up. Maria felt the familiar weight of recognition, the understanding that passed between veterans who'd faced civilian rejection in different eras, but with similar wounds. Frank, what happened to you at the airport? That wasn't your fault. No, but what happened to you at O'Malley's was partly my fault. I sat there and watched him discriminate against a Purple Heart recipient, and I said nothing because I was afraid of being associated with the controversy. Frank's voice cracked slightly. I let my 48-year-old fear silence my conscience. 3 blocks away, Patrick O'Malley was facing his own reckoning in the form of his son's packed duffel bag sitting on their kitchen table. Tommy had spent the morning at the Army recruitment office. His paperwork for delayed entry into military service spread across the kitchen counter like an ultimatum. "You're doing this to spite me," Patrick said, his voice carrying more hurt than anger. Tommy looked up from the forms he'd been reviewing, his expression older than his 19 years. "No, Dad. I'm doing this because watching what happened Thursday night made me realize I want to serve something bigger than myself. I want to earn the kind of respect that can't be taken away by someone's prejudices." Patrick stared at the military recruitment brochures, understanding that his son's decision was both rebellion and judgment. "Tommy, the military isn't what you think it is. It's dangerous. It changes people. It changed Sergeant Santos. It gave her the strength to save her squad members' lives, and it gave her the dignity to walk out of your pub without fighting back, even though she had every right to." Tommy's voice carried a conviction that made Patrick flinch. "I want that kind of character." The words hung between them like an indictment. Patrick had spent years telling himself that his business practices were justified, that his quick judgments about customers protected his family and livelihood. Now his son was choosing military service, partly as a response to his father's failure to recognize honor when it walked through his door. Back at Maria's apartment, Frank was sharing details about the IED attack that he'd learned from the extensive media coverage. "The reports say you threw yourself on Rodriguez and Jenkins when you saw the device, lost your leg below the knee, but saved their lives." Maria nodded, the memory playing out with the crystalline clarity that trauma often preserves. "I saw the wire pattern wrong. Should have spotted it sooner. By the time I realized what was happening, there was only time to act, not think." "What was it like, the moment you decided to throw yourself on that IED? Maria considered the question, understanding that Frank was asking about something deeper than tactical decisions. There wasn't really a decision. There was just the understanding that Rodriguez and Jenkins had families waiting for them. And I had the position to shield them. Everything else, my leg, my future, my life, became secondary to that mission. Frank studied her face, seeing something that reminded him of his own younger self before the airport incident had taught him to hide his service. And now you counsel other veterans who are struggling with civilian life. The hardest part isn't the physical wounds, Maria said. It's the feeling that your sacrifice doesn't matter to the people you protected, that they see you as a burden or a threat rather than someone who gave up pieces of themselves for their freedom. Frank was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the determination of someone making a decision that should have been made decades earlier. I'm going to talk to O'Malley. Tell him about my experience, about what it means when civilians reject veterans. Maybe if he understands the history, he'll understand what he did to you. Maria felt something shift inside her chest, not healing exactly, but the beginning of hope that individual courage could still matter. Frank, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I should have spoken up Thursday night, but I let fear win. I won't make that mistake again. As Frank stood to leave, Maria realized that the conversation had accomplished something unexpected. Her own wounds felt less isolating, connected now to a larger pattern of veteran experience that spanned generations. Frank's courage in sharing his story had created space for her own healing, and his commitment to confronting Patrick offered the possibility that some cycles of discrimination could be broken through individual moral courage. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as both veterans contemplated the difficulty of speaking truth to people who'd rather not hear it, and the necessity of doing so anyway. The Millfield High School auditorium hadn't seen this level of tension since the contentious school board meetings of the previous year. Every seat was filled, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Councilwoman Rebecca Walsh surveyed the packed room from the podium, recognizing faces from across the community's social and economic spectrum. Veterans, business owners, students, retirees, and families who'd never given much thought to military service. Until this week. This forum was called to address recent events that have brought national attention to our community, Walsh began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of a politician walking a tightrope. We're here to discuss how Millfield treats our veterans and what kind of community we want to be. In the third row, Maria sat between Dr. Kim and Tank, her presence drawing constant glances from the packed auditorium. She'd arrived wearing her best civilian clothes, a simple navy dress that somehow emphasized rather than concealed her military bearing. The prosthetic leg was visible, but unremarkable. Just another detail in the story of a woman who'd given more than most could imagine. Patrick O'Malley sat in the back corner with Tommy, his face pale and drawn. The past 3 days had aged him visibly, his usual swagger replaced by the hunched posture of someone who discovered that actions have consequences beyond his control. Tommy sat rigid beside his father, wearing a dress shirt and tie that suggested the seriousness with which he was treating this moment. Walsh opened the floor to speakers, and Frank Kowalski was the first to stand. His walk to the microphone carried the deliberate pace of a man who'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment, practicing words he should have spoken 48 years ago. My name is Frank Kowalski. I served in Vietnam from 1970 to 1971, and I've been silent about my service for most of my adult life. His voice, amplified by the microphone, carried clearly to every corner of the auditorium. I was silent because when I came home, civilians treated me like I was diseased, like my service was something shameful rather than something honorable. The room grew quieter as Frank continued, his words carrying the weight of decades of suppressed pain. Thursday night, I watched Patrick O'Malley refuse service to Sergeant Maria Santos, a Purple Heart recipient who lost her leg saving her squad members in Iraq. And I said nothing, because I was still afraid of being associated with controversy, still afraid of civilian rejection. Frank turned to look directly at Maria, his eyes holding an apology that went deeper than words. But staying silent makes me complicit in the discrimination that veterans face. Sergeant Santos deserved better from her community, and she deserved better from me. The applause that followed was subdued, but genuine, the kind of recognition that comes when people witness moral courage in action. Frank returned to his seat, his shoulders straighter than they'd been in decades. Dr. Kim was the next speaker, approaching the microphone with the professional bearing that had made her an effective advocate for veteran rights. I'm Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychologist at the VA center where Sergeant Santos works. I want to talk about the psychological impact of discrimination on veterans who are already struggling with reintegration. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the packed auditorium. When a veteran faces rejection from the civilian community they serve to protect, it creates a particular kind of trauma. It suggests that their sacrifice was meaningless, that their willingness to die for others is viewed as a character flaw rather than a virtue. Dr. Kim's voice grew more intense as she continued. Sergeant Santos counsels veterans who are struggling with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the challenge of finding purpose in civilian life. She helps them every day. The irony of her being treated like a threat in her own community should be obvious to everyone in this room. When Maria finally walked to the microphone, the auditorium fell completely silent. She moved with the controlled grace that marked her as someone who'd learned to navigate the world with a prosthetic leg, her bearing suggesting strength rather than limitation. I didn't ask for this attention, she began, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes focused on her. I came home from Iraq wanting to blend in, to serve quietly at the VA center and avoid drawing attention to my service or my injuries. She looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that represented every demographic of her community. But I've learned this week that silence enables discrimination. When veterans stay quiet about mistreatment, when communities avoid difficult conversations about respect and service, we allow prejudice to flourish. Maria's voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm. I lost my leg in an IED attack while saving 2 of my squad members. I came home and chose to work with other veterans because I believe in service. Thursday night, I was refused service at O'Malley's pub because someone looked at me and saw a troublemaker rather than a veteran. The auditorium was so quiet that the building's ventilation system seemed loud by comparison. Maria continued, her words carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak them. This isn't about me anymore. It's about whether Millfield is the kind of community that honors service or just talks about honoring service. It's about whether we judge people by their character and their sacrifices, or by assumptions based on their appearance. Tank stood up from his seat, his dress uniform commanding immediate attention. Permission to speak, Sergeant Santos? Maria smiled for the first time that evening. Always, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Tank approached the microphone with the bearing of someone comfortable with command. Maria Santos threw herself on an IED to save my life and Corporal Jenkins' life. She made a split-second decision to sacrifice herself for her squad. That's the person who was refused service Thursday night. His voice carried the particular intensity that comes from speaking about life and death experiences. We didn't come to Millfield to intimidate anyone. We came to demonstrate something simple, that honor should be recognized, that service should be respected, and that a Purple Heart recipient deserves better treatment than what she received. In the back corner, Patrick O'Malley stood slowly, his movement drawing every eye in the auditorium. The walk to the microphone seemed to take forever, each step carrying the weight of a decision that would define the rest of his life. My name is Patrick O'Malley, he said, his voice barely audible until he moved closer to the microphone. "I own O'Malley's pub, and I'm the person who refused to serve Sergeant Santos." The silence that followed was deafening, charged with the expectation that this moment would determine not just Patrick's future, but the community's response to discrimination in their midst. Patrick's voice cracked as he stood at the microphone, the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on him like a physical force. The silence in the auditorium stretched until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable, before he finally found the courage to continue. "I made a terrible mistake Thursday night. I looked at Sergeant Santos and saw what I wanted to see, someone I could blame for my problems, someone I could turn away to feel like I had control over something." His hands gripped the microphone stand until his knuckles went white. "I didn't see a Purple Heart recipient. I didn't see someone who'd sacrificed for this country. I saw my own fears and frustrations, and I acted on them." A murmur rippled. Through the crowd, some sympathetic, others skeptical. Patrick's confession was more than many had expected, but the damage of the past week had created fault lines in the community that wouldn't be easily repaired. "I'm sorry," Patrick continued, his eyes finding Maria in the crowd. "I'm sorry to you, Sergeant Santos, and I'm sorry to every veteran in this room who's faced the kind of discrimination I showed you. I have no excuse for my behavior." The applause that followed was scattered and uncertain, reflecting a community, unsure whether contrition was enough to heal the wound that had been opened. As Patrick returned to his seat, Tommy remained standing, his young face set with determination. "I need to say something too," Tommy announced, moving toward the microphone without waiting for permission. His father's eyes widened with alarm as his son took the stage. "I'm Tommy O'Malley, Patrick's son. I was working at the pub Thursday night, and I watched my father refuse service to Sergeant Santos. I didn't speak up, and I've been ashamed of that cowardice ever since." Tommy's voice carried the particular intensity of youth confronting moral complexity for the first time. "But I want everyone to know that I've enlisted in the army. I leave for basic training in 2 months. The announcement sent a visible shock through Patrick, who hadn't realized his son would make their family conflict public. Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. "I enlisted because watching those 5 veterans in dress uniform showed me what honor looks like. They came to defend someone who couldn't defend herself, and they did it with dignity and courage." Tommy looked directly at his father. "I want to earn that kind of respect. I want to serve something bigger than myself." As Tommy returned to his seat, Patrick's face had gone ashen. The public revelation of his son's enlistment, framed as a response to his own moral failure, hit him harder than any criticism from strangers. The forum continued for another hour, with speakers from both sides of the growing divide. Some defended Patrick's right to run his business as he saw fit, arguing that the military response had been excessive. Others shared their own experiences with discrimination, adding layers to a story that was becoming about more than one incident at one pub. Janet Rodriguez, the Korean War veteran's widow, spoke with the authority of someone who'd watched her husband struggle with civilian indifference for decades. "My Harold came home from Korea in 1953 to a country that had already forgotten there was a war. He never talked about the discrimination he faced, but I saw how it ate at him, how it made him feel like his service didn't matter." Her voice grew fierce as she continued, "We can't let that happen to another generation of veterans. We can't let Sergeant Santos or any veteran feel like their sacrifice was meaningless, because some civilians are too prejudiced to see past their own assumptions." But the forum also revealed the depth of community divisions. Bill Henderson from the hardware store represented a significant faction when he stood to defend Patrick's rights as a business owner. "I'm not defending discrimination," Henderson said carefully, "but we can't allow outside pressure to dictate how local businesses operate." Mr. O'Malley apologized, and that should be the end of it. Turning this into a national controversy helps no one. The comment drew angry responses from several veterans in the audience, including a Vietnam-era Marine who'd remained silent until now. Outside pressure, the Marine called out, his voice carrying decades of suppressed anger. The only outside pressure here is the pressure to do what's right, to treat veterans with the respect they've earned through service and sacrifice. As the forum wound down, Councilwoman Walsh attempted to find middle ground that would satisfy both sides of the increasingly polarized community. "We need to move forward constructively," she said. "Mr. O'Malley has apologized publicly. Sergeant Santos has shown remarkable grace in handling this situation. Perhaps we can use this as a learning opportunity." But as people filed out of the auditorium, it was clear that the community forum had created more divisions than it had healed. Clusters of people gathered in the parking lot, their heated conversations suggesting that Millfield was splitting into factions that viewed the incident through completely different moral lenses. Maria found herself surrounded by supporters, including several veterans she'd never met, who'd driven from neighboring towns to attend the forum. Their solidarity was warming, but she could also see the cost of the week's events in their faces, the way public controversy had forced them to relive their own experiences with discrimination. Dr. Kim approached Maria as the crowd began to thin. "How are you processing all this?" "I feel like I've become a symbol for something I never wanted to represent," Maria replied. "I just wanted to have a drink and decompress after work. Now I'm the face of veteran discrimination in Millfield." Tank, still in his dress uniform despite the evening's heat, joined their conversation. "Maria, sometimes symbols choose us rather than the other way around. The question is what we do with the platform we've been given." Across the parking lot, Patrick was having a very different conversation with Tommy as they walked to their car in tense silence. "I can't believe you announced your enlistment like that," Patrick said finally, "in front of the whole town, making it sound like you're joining the military to spite me." Tommy stopped walking, his face flushed with emotion. "I'm not doing this to spite you, Dad. I'm doing this because I want to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. The military isn't a solution to family problems, Tommy. It's dangerous. It changes people. It changed Sergeant Santos," Tommy interrupted. "It gave her the courage to save her squad members' lives, and it gave her the strength to walk out of your pub with dignity instead of fighting back. If the military can create that kind of character, then I want to be part of it." Patrick stared at his son, understanding that the week's events had created a chasm between them that an apology couldn't bridge. Tommy was choosing military service partly as a rejection of his father's values, and that choice would define their relationship for years to come. As they drove home through Millfield's quiet streets, both father and son understood that some fault lines once opened reshaped the entire landscape. The community forum had been intended to heal divisions, but it had instead revealed how deeply the incident at O'Malley's pub had fractured a town that had thought it understood its own values. 3 weeks after the community forum, O'Malley's pub sat nearly empty on what should have been a busy Friday evening. The aftermath of Patrick's public apology had created an unexpected consequence. Instead of healing the community divide, it had deepened it. Half the town viewed his contrition as genuine and necessary, while the other half saw it as capitulation to outside pressure. The result was a boycott from both sides that was slowly strangling his business. Patrick stood behind the bar, methodically, cleaning glasses that were already spotless, his movements mechanical and repetitive. The lunch crowd had consisted of 3 regulars and a traveling salesman who'd seemed uncomfortable with the tension that hung in the air like smoke. The evening rush that had once filled the pub with laughter and conversation had dwindled to a handful of customers who sat in careful isolation, avoiding eye contact and conversation. Tommy worked the kitchen with grim efficiency, preparing food for orders that rarely came. The acceptance letter from the army had arrived 2 days earlier, confirming his departure date for basic training. 8 weeks remained before he would leave Millfield, possibly forever, and the approaching separation had created a strange intimacy between father and son, both aware that their relationship was fracturing but unable to find words to repair it. The front door opened with its familiar chime, and Frank Kowalski entered with the careful movements of a man whose arthritis was acting up. He'd become a regular since the community forum, his presence both a gesture of support for Patrick's attempt at redemption and a form of penance for his own decades of silence. "Evening, Frank," Patrick said, automatically reaching for the beer tap. Frank's order never varied, a Budweiser and whatever soup was on the menu. "Patrick." Frank settled onto his usual bar stool with the grunt of a 77-year-old body protesting the day's activities. Quiet night. It wasn't really a question, and Patrick didn't treat it as one. The quietness of O'Malley's had become a shared burden among the few customers who still frequented the establishment. They were all witnesses to the slow death of a business that had served the community for 3 generations. "Thinking about closing early," Patrick admitted, his voice carrying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "No point staying open for 3 customers. Frank accepted his beer and studied Patrick's face in the dim light of the bar. The past month had aged the pub owner visibly. His hair seemed grayer, his shoulders more rounded, his movements lacking the aggressive confidence that had once defined his interactions with customers. "Tommy leave yet?" 8 weeks. Patrick's voice caught slightly on the words. "Basic training at Fort Moore, then who knows where. He's excited about it, talks about serving his country and earning respect through sacrifice." The bitterness in Patrick's tone was unmistakable. All the things he apparently can't get from his family. Frank sipped his beer, understanding that Patrick was approaching a breakdown that had been building since the night he'd refused to serve Maria Santos. The apology at the community forum had been genuine, but it had also stripped away the defensive anger that had helped Patrick avoid examining his own motivations and fears. "You know what the hardest part is," Patrick continued, his voice growing louder as the evening's isolation loosened his usual restraint. "Everyone thinks I discriminated against that woman because I'm some kind of racist. But it wasn't about her being Hispanic. It wasn't even about her being a veteran." Frank waited, sensing that Patrick was finally ready to voice something he'd been avoiding for weeks. "It was about fear," Patrick said, his words coming faster now, as if speaking them quickly might make them less shameful. "Fear that I'm losing everything my grandfather and father built. Fear that the world is changing in ways I don't understand. Fear that people like me, small business owners who play by the old rules, don't matter anymore." Patrick set down the glass he'd been gleaning with enough force to make Frank flinch. She walked in looking confident, looking like she belonged anywhere she wanted to be. And I resented that confidence because I haven't felt it in years. So I used my authority as the owner to make her feel small, to prove that I still had power over something. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful in its honesty. Frank recognized the particular shame that came from admitting to moral cowardice, the way it felt to acknowledge that fear had made you smaller than you'd ever intended to be. "Fear makes us do terrible things," Frank said quietly. "Makes us hurt people who don't deserve it, makes us stay silent when we should speak up. I know something about that." Tommy emerged from the kitchen, having overheard the conversation despite his father's lowered voice. At 19, he was still young enough to believe that moral clarity was simple, that right and wrong were easily distinguished, but old enough to understand that his father's confession represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. "Dad," Tommy said, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised both older men. "Is that why you don't want me to enlist? Because you're afraid?" Patrick looked at his son, tall, earnest, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that Patrick had once possessed but lost somewhere in the daily grind of running a failing business in a changing world. The truth was more complex than fear, but it started there. "I'm terrified," Patrick admitted. "I'm terrified that you'll get hurt, that you'll come home changed, that you'll see things that will haunt you for the rest of your life. But mostly, I'm terrified that you'll come home and look at me the way you've been looking at me since that night with Sergeant Santos." Tommy moved closer, his expression shifting from judgment to something approaching understanding. "How have I been looking at you? Like you're ashamed of me, like I'm everything you don't want to become." Patrick's voice cracked on the words. "And maybe you're right to feel that way. Maybe I am a small, bitter man who takes out his frustrations on people who don't deserve it." The silence that followed was different from the usual tension that had characterized their interactions since the incident. This silence held the possibility of honesty, of a conversation that might actually bridge the gap that had opened between them. "I'm not ashamed of you," Tommy said finally. "I'm disappointed. There's a difference." Frank watched the interaction between father and son, remembering his own father's reaction when he'd enlisted for Vietnam. The older generation's fear for their children's safety often came wrapped in opposition that felt like rejection, creating wounds that could last decades if left unaddressed. "Your father's fear comes from love," Frank said, addressing Tommy, but speaking loudly enough for Patrick to hear. "When I enlisted for Vietnam, my father tried everything to talk me out of it. Called me foolish, said I was throwing my life away for politicians who didn't care about boys like us. It took me years to understand that his opposition came from terror at the thought of losing me." Patrick stared at Frank, seeing a reflection of his own fears in the old veteran's words. "Did your father ever tell you he was proud of your service?" "No," Frank said quietly. "He died while I was in country, never got the chance. That's one of the reasons I stayed silent about my service for so long. I never had his blessing, never heard him say that what I was doing mattered." The weight of that revelation settled over the three men, each understanding how the absence of family support could echo through decades of a veteran's life. Tommy looked at his father with new comprehension, beginning to see how fear and love could become so tangled that they appeared indistinguishable. "I don't want you to enlist to prove something to me," Patrick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to risk your life because you're disappointed in your father." "I'm not enlisting because of you," Tommy replied, but his tone had lost its earlier edge. "I'm enlisting because I want to serve something bigger than myself. Because I want to earn the kind of respect that Sergeant Santos and her unit have earned. Because I want to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Patrick nodded slowly, understanding that his son's motivation was both independent of and connected to the events of the past month. Tommy wasn't joining the military to spite his father, but he was joining partly because he'd witnessed what courage looked like when Maria's unit had demonstrated in dress uniform, and he wanted to be part of something that created that kind of character. "If you're determined to do this," Patrick said, the words feeling like they were being torn from his chest, "then I want you to know that I'm proud of your decision, even if I'm terrified of the consequences." Tommy's eyes widened slightly. These were the words he'd been hoping to hear since announcing his enlistment, but he'd given up, expecting them after weeks of tension and argument. "I want you to know," Patrick continued, "that Sergeant Santos was right when she said some people judge by character and sacrifice, while others judge by assumptions and appearance. I've been the second kind of person for too long, and watching you choose to serve has made me realize what I've lost by choosing fear over courage." Frank raised his beer in a small salute, to making better choices tomorrow than we made yesterday. The three men drank in silence, each contemplating the ways that individual decisions created ripple effects that extended far beyond their original scope. Patrick's discrimination against Maria had revealed fault lines in his community and his family, but it had also created opportunities for growth and understanding that might not have existed otherwise. 2 miles away, Maria was conducting her final counseling session of the day with Corporal Williams, a Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan and was struggling with the transition to civilian life. Williams had been following the news coverage of the O'Malley's incident with particular interest, seeing his own experiences with discrimination reflected in Maria's story. "How do you handle it?" Williams asked, his prosthetic legs stretched out in front of him as he leaned back in the VA Center's comfortable counseling chairs. "The way civilians look at you like you're broken, like your sacrifice was your fault." Maria considered the question, thinking about the changes in her own perspective over the past month. "I used to try to hide my service, to blend in and avoid drawing attention to my injuries or my military background. I thought that if I could just be invisible enough, I wouldn't have to deal with other people's assumptions and prejudices." She gestured toward the window where the lights of Millfield were beginning to twinkle in the evening darkness. "But hiding doesn't protect you from discrimination. It just makes you feel alone when it happens. What I've learned over the past month is that there's strength in community and having people who understand what you've been through and are willing to stand up for you." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Your unit showing up in dress uniform, that must have felt good." "It felt like I mattered," Maria said simply. "Like my service and my sacrifice meant something to people who understood the cost. That's what I want you to remember when you're dealing with civilian ignorance or prejudice. Your service matters, your sacrifice has meaning, and you're not alone in dealing with the challenges of reintegration." Dr. Kim knocked on the doorframe, indicating that the session time was up, but also wanting to check on Maria's emotional state. The past month had been challenging for her as well, balancing her professional responsibilities with her role as an advocate for veteran rights. "How are you holding up?" Dr. Kim asked after Williams had left for the evening. "Better than I expected," Maria replied honestly. "The publicity has been difficult, but it's also connected me with veterans from across the country who've faced similar discrimination. I'm not sure I would have chosen to become a public figure, but there's something powerful about knowing that speaking up can help other people find their voices." Dr. Kim smiled, recognizing the growth in Maria's perspective since the night she'd been refused service at O'Malley's pub. "Tank called earlier. He wanted you to know that he's been contacted by veteran advocacy groups who are interested in supporting your story. Apparently, what started as a local incident is becoming part of a national conversation about how veterans are treated in civilian communities." Maria felt a familiar mix of pride and apprehension at the news. The attention was gratifying in its way, but it also meant that her personal experience had become public property, subject to interpretation and analysis by people who'd never worn a uniform or made the kinds of sacrifices that military service demanded. "There's something else," Dr. Kim continued. "Patrick O'Malley called the center this afternoon. He wants to meet with you privately, to apologize personally, and discuss ways he might make amends for what happened." The request surprised Maria, though she realized it shouldn't have. Patrick's public apology at the community forum had seemed genuine, but she'd assumed that would be the end of their interaction. The idea of a private conversation with the man who discriminated against her was both intriguing and uncomfortable. "What do you think?" Maria asked. "I think it's your decision," Dr. Kim replied. But I also think there might be value in a conversation that isn't conducted in front of cameras and crowds. Sometimes real understanding happens in private moments, when people can speak honestly without worrying about public perception. And as Maria drove home through Millfield's quiet streets, she thought about the interconnected nature of the past month's events. Patrick's discrimination had revealed community divisions, but it had also created opportunities for healing and growth. Tommy's decision to enlist had strained his relationship with his father, but it had also forced honest conversations about fear, courage, and the meaning of service. Frank's decision to speak up after decades of silence had connected him to a community of veterans he'd never acknowledged before. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tank. Deployment orders came through. Afghanistan 6 months? Wanted you to? No, before it hits the news. Maria stared at the message, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and fear that came whenever someone she cared about was heading into danger. Tank's deployment was a reminder that military service was ongoing, that the brotherhood she'd experienced with her unit would continue to be tested by new challenges and separations. She typed back, "Stay safe. Come home in one piece. We'll be here when you get back." The response came immediately. "Always, Sergeant, take care of yourself. You've got people who care about you now." Maria smiled at the truth of that statement. A month ago, she'd felt isolated in civilian life, carrying her service and her wounds alone. Now, she was part of a community that extended far beyond Millfield, connected to veterans across the country who understood the cost of service and the challenge of reintegration. The incident at O'Malley's pub had been painful, but it had also revealed something important about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Sometimes, Maria realized, the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with dignity, courage, and the willingness to speak truth, even when the audience doesn't want to hear it. 3 months later, the autumn air carried the smell of fallen leaves and new beginnings through Millfield's downtown district. O'Malley's pub bore little resemblance to the establishment where Maria Santos had been refused service on that rainy Thursday evening. The exterior had been repainted in warm earth tones, and a new sign beside the front door read, "All who serve are welcome here." Below it, in smaller text, "Proudly supporting our veterans." Inside, the transformation was even more dramatic. One wall had been converted into a memorial honoring local veterans, featuring photographs and brief biographies of service members from every conflict since World War II. Maria's Purple Heart citation occupied a place of honor, alongside Frank, Kowalski's Vietnam service record, and dozens of others who had served their country with distinction. Patrick O'Malley stood behind the bar, his posture straighter than it had been in months, preparing for the evening's special event. Tonight marked Tommy's official send-off party before he left for basic training, but it had evolved into something larger. A community celebration of service that drew veterans and civilians together in a way Millfield hadn't experienced in decades. The private conversation between Patrick and Maria 6 weeks earlier had been the catalyst for many of the changes. Meeting in Dr. Kim's office at the VA Center with only the two of them present, Patrick had offered an apology that went far deeper than his public statement at the community forum. "I looked at you and saw everything I was afraid of," he had said, his voice heavy with shame. "Change, confidence, someone who belonged everywhere while I felt like I belonged nowhere. I used my position as a business owner to hurt you because I felt powerless in every other aspect of my life." Maria had listened without interrupting, recognizing the courage it took for Patrick to examine his own motivations so honestly. When he finished, she had surprised him with her response. "What you did was wrong," she said clearly, "but I understand something about fear and how it can make us smaller than we want to be. The question is what you do next, whether you use this as an opportunity to grow or whether you let it define you as a victim of circumstances beyond your control. That conversation had led to Patrick's decision to transform O'Malley's pub into something that honored rather than ignored the military service in his community. The changes hadn't been merely cosmetic. He had instituted policies offering discounts to veterans, had begun hosting monthly meetings for veteran support groups, and had partnered with the VA Center to provide job placement assistance for transitioning service members. Now, as the evening's guests began arriving, Patrick felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine pride in what his establishment represented. The crowd was diverse in ways that the old O'Malleys had never been. Veterans from multiple conflicts, young families, business owners who had initially boycotted the pub, and civic leaders who had come to see tonight's event as a symbol of community healing. Tommy emerged from the kitchen wearing his dress uniform, the sight of which still caused Patrick a complex mixture of pride and terror. The past months had brought father and son closer together as they navigated the approaching separation, but Patrick's fears about Tommy's safety remained constant companions. "You look good, son," Patrick said, his voice catching slightly on the words. The transformation in their relationship had been gradual but profound, fear giving way to understanding, opposition evolving into support. "Thanks, Dad." Tommy's response carried none of the tension that had characterized their interactions during the immediate aftermath of the discrimination incident. "I still can't believe how many people showed up." The evening crowd was indeed impressive. Frank Kowalski held court at a corner table, sharing Vietnam stories with a group of younger veterans who hung on his words with the respect accorded to someone who had broken decades of silence to support a fellow veteran. Dr. Kim moved through the crowd with professional grace, introducing veterans to civilian community members and facilitating conversations that might not have happened otherwise. Maria entered at exactly 7 o'clock, accompanied by Lisa Chen, who had driven down from Charlotte for the occasion. Tank was deployed to Afghanistan, but he had sent a video message that would be played later in the evening. Rodriguez and Williams had flown in from their respective cities, their presence a reminder that the bonds forged in military service transcended geographic boundaries. The sight of Maria walking confidently through O'Malley's front door, the same door she had exited in humiliation 3 months earlier, created a moment of symbolic power that wasn't lost on anyone present. Patrick approached her immediately, his expression carrying genuine warmth rather than the wariness she had faced during her first visit. "Sergeant Santos, welcome back to O'Malley's. Thank you for being here tonight." "Thank you for the invitation, Patrick. The place looks incredible." The use of first names marked a transition that both found significant. The formal distance of Mr. O'Malley and Sergeant Santos had given way to something approaching friendship, built on honest acknowledgement of past mistakes and mutual commitment to moving forward constructively. Councilwoman Rebecca Walsh took the microphone that had been set up near the Veteran Memorial Wall, her political instincts recognizing the importance of the moment while her personal convictions drove her words. 3 months ago, our community faced a crisis that revealed uncomfortable truths about how we treat the people who serve our country, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed pub. "Tonight, we're celebrating not just Tommy, O'Malley's commitment to military service, but our community's commitment to honoring all who serve." She gestured toward the memorial wall, where photographs of local veterans created a visual representation of Millfield's military heritage. These walls now tell the story of our community's sacrifice and service. They remind us that freedom isn't free, and that the people who pay its price deserve our respect and gratitude, not our assumptions and prejudices. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, reflecting a community that had used a moment of crisis to examine its values and commit to doing better. Walsh continued, her political experience evident in her ability to acknowledge past failures while celebrating current progress. I want to recognize Patrick O'Malley for having the courage to admit his mistakes and the commitment to make meaningful changes. Transformation isn't easy, especially when it requires acknowledging our own moral failures. But it's necessary if we want to be the kind of community that deserves the sacrifice made by people like Sergeant Santos. Patrick found himself fighting back tears as the crowd applauded, understanding that public redemption was both more difficult and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. The journey from discrimination to advocacy had been painful, but it had also connected him to his community in ways that his previous role as a defensive business owner had never achieved. Dr. Kim spoke next, her professional perspective adding depth to the evening's celebration. Veteran reintegration is one of the most challenging aspects of military service. When service members come home, they face not just the physical and psychological wounds of combat, but the often more subtle wounds of civilian indifference or hostility. She looked directly at Maria, her expression carrying both professional pride and personal affection. Sergeant Santos has shown remarkable courage, not just in combat, but in using her experience with discrimination to advocate for other veterans facing similar challenges. Her willingness to speak up has created opportunities for healing that extend far beyond Millfield. Frank Kowalski's speech was brief but powerful, his decades of silence making his current advocacy all the more meaningful. I stayed quiet about my service for 48 years because I was afraid of civilian rejection. Watching Sergeant Santos face discrimination with dignity and watching this community choose to grow rather than defend prejudice has given me the courage to claim my place as a veteran. He paused, his weathered hands gripping the microphone stand. To Tommy O'Malley and all the young people considering military service, you're joining a brotherhood and sisterhood that extends across generations and conflicts. We'll be here when you come home, and we'll make sure you're treated with the respect you've earned. When Maria finally spoke, her words carried the authority of someone who had transformed personal pain into public advocacy. 3 months ago, I was refused service in this establishment because someone looked at me and saw a threat rather than a veteran. Tonight, I'm standing in a place that celebrates military service and honors the sacrifices made by people who choose to serve others. She gestured toward Tommy, who stood with his parents near the bar. Tommy O'Malley is beginning a journey that will test him in ways he can't imagine. He'll face dangers, make sacrifices, and hopefully come home changed by the experience of serving something bigger than himself. When he returns, he deserves better than what I received 3 months ago. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued. But more than that, he deserves to come home to a community that understands the value of service, that honors sacrifice, and that judges people by their character rather than their appearance. Tonight suggests that Millfield is becoming that kind of community. As the formal speeches concluded, the evening evolved into something more intimate and personal. Veterans shared stories with civilians who listened with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Tommy received advice from multiple generations of service members, each offering perspective on the challenges and rewards of military life. Patrick found himself in conversation with Rodriguez, the young veteran whose life Maria had saved during the IED attack. "Your son is lucky," Rodriguez said, watching Tommy interact with the crowd. "He's got a community that's learned to value service and a father who's learned to put love before fear." "It took almost losing him to learn that lesson," Patrick replied honestly. "Fear makes you smaller than you want to be. I'm trying to be bigger now." As the evening wound down, Tommy stood to address the crowd one final time, His youth was evident in his nervous energy, but his words carried the conviction of someone who had made a deliberate choice about the direction of his life. When I enlisted, some people thought I was doing it to spite my father or to make a statement about what happened here 3 months ago. But I'm enlisting because I've seen what service can create, the kind of bonds that bring people together across time and distance, the kind of character that faces discrimination with dignity, the kind of community that chooses growth over defensiveness. He looked at his father, his expression carrying both love and determination. I'm not afraid of military service because I've learned that the real courage isn't in avoiding danger. It's in choosing to serve others, even when the cost is high. That's what Sergeant Santos did when she saved her squad members. And that's what this community did when it chose to confront its own prejudices. The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, reflecting a community that had used a moment of crisis to rediscover its values and recommit to honoring the people who served to protect them. As guests began to leave, Maria found herself standing before the memorial wall, reading the citations and biographies of veterans she had never known, but whose service had helped create the freedom she had served to protect. The photographs represented multiple generations of sacrifice, a visual reminder that her own service was part of a larger continuum of dedication to something beyond individual self-interest. Patrick approached her as she studied the wall, his presence no longer carrying the tension that had characterized their early interactions. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me the chance to be better than I was." Maria turned to face him, seeing not the bitter, defensive man who had refused her service, but someone who had chosen growth over victimhood, understanding over resentment. "Thank you for proving that people can change, that communities can heal, and that individual courage can create ripple effects that extend far beyond anything we can imagine." Outside O'Malley's pub, the autumn evening was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that suggested new beginnings and fresh possibilities. Millfield's transformation wasn't complete. Communities, like individuals, change slowly and imperfectly. But tonight had demonstrated something important about the power of honest acknowledgement, genuine growth, and the choice to honor service rather than ignore it. Maria drove home through streets that felt different than they had 3 months earlier, not because the physical landscape had changed, but because her place in the community had been redefined. She was no longer an invisible veteran trying to blend into civilian life, but a recognized advocate whose voice mattered and whose service was valued. The incident that had begun with discrimination and humiliation had evolved into something that honored the best traditions of American military service. The understanding that some things are worth fighting for, that individual courage can inspire collective action, and that the bonds forged through shared sacrifice create communities strong enough to confront their own failures and grow from them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.